Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me on my talk, Executive Dysfunction Luncheon, How to Cook When We Just Can't. Today, we'll be exploring the different ways our ADHD can affect how we look at cooking for ourselves and feeding ourselves. After that, we will be exploring strategies that can be put in place to help with challenges we face. Then I'll do a cooking demo at the end to show you some recipes you can make for different scenarios, like when you have low spoons and have to feed yourself, low lift items to bring to a potluck or gathering, and things you can have in the kitchen that will help you be more successful without much extra effort. What this talk and demo will not have is any guidance on how to eat. I have a culinary background and I'm not a dietitian. I have neither the expertise nor the desire to tell anyone what they should and shouldn't eat. You all will have the best knowledge of how you would like to eat and what foods you would like to avoid. For the recipes at the end, if certain ingredients don't follow your dietary restrictions, feel free to revise them to what works for you. My name is Jaylyn, and I'll be your friendly cooking guide today. Before we go on, it would probably be a good idea to introduce myself and tell you about my background. I'm currently an ADHD coach, speaker, instructor, podcaster, and content creator. I'm also a facilitator for ADA's Asians with ADHD virtual peer support group and the co-founder of the Monoceros Initiative, which puts on collaboration cruises and events for ADHD professionals and content creators. That's me now. Here's what I've done in the past. Most recently, I was Google's first and only ADHD trained peer coach and the co-founder of the ADHD Women at Google Employee Resource Group after being diagnosed with ADHD in 2019 at the age of 34. Years before that, I had a career in the hospitality industry after going to culinary school and graduating from San Jose State University with a degree in hospitality management. I owned a food truck that made low-calorie comfort food, then sliders and pie, and then co-owned the first to market restaurant in downtown San Jose. There are many ADHD individuals, both diagnosed and undiagnosed, in the food industry. For many, their relationship with food is nuanced. I am no exception. I know a lot about food, but I've had a very complicated relationship with it. It's been the focus of my nerd interests for decades, but also because of my ADHD, a huge struggle for me on an ongoing basis, both because of the pain surrounding food in my past and because of the way my ADHD can present. So what does that mean? How does ADHD affect how we see food? Well, before I go into the difficulties, I want to bring up one point about executive dysfunction. The overwhelm that sometimes comes with executive dysfunction has a huge effect on our curiosity and motivation. The feeling that all of this is too much can cause us to shut down and avoid cooking entirely. Some of you may be feeling this way as I'm explaining all the ways ADHD can affect us. Please stick around to the end and allow us to get to the helpful parts. Okay, I will be sharing what many consider to be the cornerstones of ADHD, as well as how our cooking and eating is affected by this. Difficulty with sensory processing can make it so that we have sensory overload, or the opposite, being sensory seeking, which can present as stimming, or something that many call getting the icks, having a negative response to sensory input like texture, taste, smell, or images. Sensory processing difficulties can make it so that we have negative reactions to some foods. And this sometimes happens to us with foods we like and have been eating for a long time. The icks can come on suddenly. We also have negative reactions to a smelly kitchen, making food that doesn't look visually appealing, getting grossed out with certain food textures, and other sensory disturbances. On the other end of the results spectrum, we can require stimming to get more sensory input. Some of us feel the need to snack on something while we're cooking, or watch TV, or listen to a podcast. For me personally, the TV is always on when I'm cooking, and despite logic against it, it keeps me focused on what I need to do. As long as it's a TV show, I don't need to pay close attention to. We can have hyperactive bodies, which can cause fidgeting and restlessness, and or a hyperactive mind, which can cause us to zone out, make careless mistakes, have trouble sleeping or getting out of bed, and blurting or interrupting to get to the end faster. A hyperactive body can mean just doing the actions around cooking doesn't feel like it's enough for us to stay engaged. We can want to multitask for moments when we feel like we're just standing around, like when we're waiting for food to come up to a certain temperature, and then realize too late that we were distracted when a critical temperature or moment of browning happened, or the pasta water is boiling over and now things are burnt or the results aren't as good as we wanted them to be. We can even run off and do something else while our food burns on the stove or in the oven. Hyperactive minds can cause us to zone out, which can sometimes be detrimental to the cooking process, or in less disastrous situations, just make the cooking process take a lot longer than it does for other people. Careless mistakes from zoning out can lead to leaving out key ingredients, adding too much or too little of an ingredient, or cause us to have kitchen injuries. Having trouble going to sleep or getting out of bed can make it difficult for us to get nourishment first thing in the morning, adding to stress, especially for those who take stimulant medications that work more consistently when taken with food. Executive dysfunction can cause us to have hyperfixation, time blindness, difficulty context switching, difficulty finishing tasks, disorganization, forgetfulness, and a propensity to misplace items. Executive dysfunction in general makes cooking a lot harder. Lower working memory can make it more difficult to do multiple parallels or multi-step processes required for some recipes and cause us to make more careless mistakes. Time blindness can make it so that we don't adequately plan for the time requirements of cooking and can make it so that we are rushing and stressed out at the end, or think that something has been cooking for a shorter or longer period of time than it actually has. Difficulty context switching can make it so that we finish one component of a dish, like the entree, before the other components, like sides or baked items, are complete. Forgetfulness can lead us to forgetting to purchase certain ingredients, forgetting to add a certain ingredient, and forgetting to thaw a frozen item that we need to use. Disorganization and a propensity to misplace items can lead to not being able to find an ingredient or necessary cooking equipment, and or lead to more cluttered kitchens that we don't feel at ease cooking in. Lower baseline levels of dopamine can lead to us seeking more dopamine. Seeking more dopamine can present as addiction, eating disorders, hyperfixation, and impulse control. It also causes us to lean toward optimization because we get big boosts of dopamine when we're brainstorming and coming up with the most ideal solutions. So many of us tend to want to stay in the optimization trap for long periods of time instead of moving on to the doing parts of our actions. The dopamine seeking we get from having lower baseline levels of dopamine can have an enormous effect on cooking and eating. Hyperfixation is a huge disruptor when it comes to food. Ever find something new that you love and go through that first box really quickly, then buy a whole bunch of it so that you can always have it in stock, only to find that you can't get yourself to want to eat it anymore? I know I have. A lot. That can lead to overstocked pantries and expired food. Impulse control is also a factor with food, especially when we buy lots of food at the grocery store, then can't get ourselves to cook it later on in the week, or when we buy so much fresh produce or meat that we can't possibly go through it in time before it turns, or when we buy food on impulse that we don't feel good eating later on. Aside from that, dopamine seeking can lead to impulsive eating because food, especially high fat and sugar food, tends to give us a big hit of dopamine. And this means that after coming home from a depleting day at work or a stressful day in our personal lives, it might be hard to stick to the meal plan that was set out and reach for a dopamine heavy snack instead. It's one of the most immediate and easy to reach for dopamine boosts we can get when our cognitive energy feels depleted. Eating disorders are hugely prevalent in ADHD populations because the way our brains respond to eating differs from neurotypicals. Binge eating is common because our brains are getting big waves of dopamine that can override our natural satiety signals. But also, many other eating disorders are very prevalent in ADHD populations as well because we can often yearn for a sense of control in our lives, which is a factor in many eating disorders like anorexia and orthorexia, which we will discuss shortly. The emotional dysregulation that comes from executive dysfunction can lead to people pleasing, loose boundaries, shame, trauma, and rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or having such a painful response to rejection that we do everything we can to avoid it, many times to our detriment. Emotional dysregulation is what I consider to be the biggest factor when it comes to cooking feeling intimidating or not worth the trouble to someone. With emotional dysregulation, we can have a higher response to emotional stimuli, a greater difficulty with processing and interpreting those emotions, a greater difficulty returning to a less emotional state, and difficulty processing the aftermath of those emotions. This means that when something goes wrong in the kitchen, we can have greater negative reactions to what happened, have trouble reconciling those feelings, have a really terrible rest of the night, and then feel shame about how, overcooking the chicken caused us to be in a bad mood for the whole night. Or because we are in an emotional state when we return home, we aren't quite in the mood to get out a pan and start cooking, so we order DoorDash instead. The emotional dysregulation in interpersonal situations also factors into how we feel about cooking. Loose boundaries can make us try to do too much and then have expectations for ourselves that aren't reasonable, and have us attach resentment to others in situations that don't necessarily call for it. Does anyone have a relative that insists on making all the food for holiday dinners, then complains the whole time about how they're doing all the work and no one is appreciative? Are you that relative? Again, this is common. Many of us are people pleasers, and we can plan to make huge crowd pleasing things for other people, maybe even recipes out of our current skill set. And then what happens when it doesn't turn out perfectly? What happens if no one comments on how good it is? What happens if no one eats it? Does it feel like rejection? Does it feel like that says something about our abilities and our self-worth? How do we feel in that situation? Anger, frustration, shame? Shame about not being a good enough cook? Shame about needing validation from others? Shame about all the factors that led up to this moment that I mentioned earlier? And what does that shame do to our motivation to cook? Usually nothing good. Okay, so what I just went over are simple ways our ADHD can affect our success and confidence around cooking. But sometimes multiple factors combine to make a perfect storm of difficulty around the process of cooking. This explanation of how dopamine works in typical and neurodivergent brains might shed some light into the process of cooking. It's an example that I use in my ADHD learning program, and usually when I use it as an example, almost everyone says something around the lines of, "This just happened to me last week," or "That's what happened to me the last time I cooked." This is how the normal dopamine process would go for us if we had a neurotypical brain, using the example of having a craving for chicken parmesan. We decide we want to eat chicken parm and we anticipate the reward of eating something delicious. We get a stream of dopamine that gives us the motivating energy and focus to procure the necessary ingredients and cook the chicken parm. We eat the chicken parm and it's tasty, giving us the result we anticipated, and our brains give us a big boost of dopamine to say, "Job well done," and we're pumped to make it again. Yep, that's what would happen if our dopamine levels were functioning normally. Most ADHD individuals chuckle at how foreign that experience is when I share that. Here's one example of where the dopamine process can go wrong for us as ADHD individuals. In this common ADHD scenario, we have a craving for chicken parm and decide to make it. We have low motivating energy to start doing things, so we look up chicken parm recipes to try to find the best one to try to boost our motivating energy. We end up looking up chicken parm recipes and chicken parm cooking videos for hours. Eventually, this gets tiring, so we move on to something else. It's now 1 hour before dinner time and we still want chicken parm. So we grab a random recipe we looked at and frantically go to the store to get all the ingredients, but we're anxious and unfocused. We make the chicken parm, but it's hours past dinner time. And considering the hours we spent looking up recipes and how stressed we feel, the chicken parm doesn't taste good enough. We feel bad about the whole experience and don't get the dopamine hit afterward. We never make chicken parm again, and the next time we decide to cook, we remember this experience and feel bad, and either decide not to do it or say if we make this thing perfectly, we can redeem ourselves. The process repeats, and our feelings toward cooking have a greater negative association every time. When I ask my learning program participants if they resonate with that scenario when it comes to cooking, almost everyone raises their hand. When I ask if they resonate with that scenario when it comes to non-cooking things too, almost all of those hands stay up. Part of the reason why that chicken parm scenario happens is because of the optimization trap. This is a concept I discuss a lot and was the reason why I started a podcast. We ADHD individuals lean heavily toward optimization and can sometimes go off the rails with what we're optimizing for. We often run toward the most creative, unique, wow factor solutions instead of what is actually optimal for our current needs. But when it's time for us to move into the doing phase, that rush of dopamine then drops off, leaving us with lower executive function at a time when we're doing something with high executive function needs. This can affect us in multiple ways. The optimization can create tons of complexity for the thing we're cooking, which actually reduces our chances of successfully executing on that optimal dish. So it's common that when we're bringing an item to a potluck, we obsess about what we will bring and try a flashy new recipe for the first time. But if our goals are to bring an excellent tasting dish to a potluck, what is the likelihood that this untested new recipe lives up to that expectation? The optimization trap can also make us feel exhausted from the research, which decreases how empowered and excited we feel to actually follow through on it. Have you ever been excited to bring something to a potluck or dinner gathering, then spend so much time researching and optimizing that making the thing no longer brought joy or excitement and morphed into a chore? This is why. Another reason optimization gets in our way is by making the standards too hard to achieve. One way this presents is as orthorexia, which, depending on who you talk to, can be an eating disorder or a way other disordered eating can present. Orthorexia is an obsession with healthy eating. I know a lot of neurodivergent individuals who fall into this camp, and I have been recovering from this for over a decade. Orthorexia can make procuring and cooking food extremely difficult because the standards for what we will be making can be too high. I want to use the highest nutrient vegetables, antibiotic free-range meat, low fat, low sugar, no preservatives, only organic, whole foods, raw, the list goes on. And orthorexia is not the end to those unreasonable standards. They can also be paired with other optimal standards like, I don't want to use aluminum foil in my cooking. I don't want to use disposables or plastic packaging, although those two can also be orthorexia. I only want to buy food from small local farms. I want to buy whole vegetables and prep them because it's less expensive to do so. I only want to make authentic recipes. I want to make everything from scratch. When the standards are that high and it's matched with a low spoons mood, how likely is it for us to actually cook for ourselves? The people I know who have these high standards for eating tend not to eat the way they want to most of the time. Their process has become so hard for them to meet that they will throw their hands up and eat takeout. And that takeout comes in aluminum or plastic with food from a factory farm with disposables and is expensive. Then comes the shame from breaking their own standards, then the avoidance of cooking due to the shame and pressure from failing to achieve those high standards. So it's not just the simple ways ADHD affects us, it's also the optimization and dopamine processes that can get in our way. Whew, that was a doozy of a list of challenges. And because we're all such different humans, I'm sure there are even a few that I didn't mention. Shake it off, because now we're going to go into ways to mitigate some of these challenges. First off, if you came here for a quick and dirty list of ways you can make cooking easier for you, I'm sorry to say that you're not going to get it here. The reasoning for this is that we're all very different individuals, and what works for one person might not work for another because what's getting in our way might be different. Instead, I'm going to give you broad stroke advice for approaching cooking, then explain how each of these can be applied to help with your cooking challenge scenarios. Okay, broad stroke advice number 1, be clear about what your goals are. This can be applied to individual meals and to our expectations with cooking in general. Here's how it applies to individual meals. Let's say you're bringing a dish to your family's holiday dinner. What are your goals for that before optimizing? Probably something like, I want to make something that people will enjoy eating. So does it make sense for the thing we're bringing to be super fancy and exotic? Or does it make more sense for us to bring a simple crowd favorite? It's also really common for my clients to optimize on their goals around eating. A common thing that is said is that they want to maximize their energy, and they want to lose weight, and they want to save money by cooking at home, and they want to make everything from scratch, and they want to be a better cook, and they want to have people over for dinner parties. There's more, but you get the point. It's not realistic for them to achieve all of those lofty goals, and that applies to everyone, by the way, not just people with ADHD. And considering many of them are coming from not having a cooking routine in place at all, that is a huge life change that is statistically not sustainable. So I tell people to limit their goals to 3 and prioritize them from most important to least important. An example of this would be 1, save money on meals, 2, eat more vegetables, 3, get more comfortable cooking. I'm not saying that you can't ever add other factors to the mix, but if any of those ever conflict with the goals of the top 3, you know what takes priority. And after, say, 3 months of getting this routine down, those factors can be reassessed and other things can be added. Just don't reassess too early because we ADHD folk love to do that. Okay, broad stroke advice number 2. Be reasonable/compassionate with your expectations for yourself. This applies to your time, your energy, your abilities, and what you will and won't eat. There's a lot of shame I hear from my peers about how they feel like they should spend more time cooking for their families, or that they feel shame about how they're too tired to cook after work, or shame that they can't get themselves to eat that salad for dinner, or shame that they could only cook something basic like boiled pasta and jarred sauce. Basic is their description of it, not mine. If anyone is cooking for themselves, I applaud it. All of this shame, like in other aspects of our lives with ADHD, has a negative effect on our empowerment and motivating energy. So it's actually doing more damage to us to feel shame about how we're not cooking than it is for us to be compassionate toward ourselves. If you are meeting the top 3 goals that I just talked about, feel good about it, because that feel good acknowledgement will help propel you forward. If you're often too tired or depleted after work, factor that into your expectations. Have after work dinners be easy to heat up leftovers, or make something that is a low spoons or low energy and dopamine recipe. Don't expect yourself to make an executive function heavy recipe after work if that isn't in line with how you're feeling after work. If you don't have a lot of experience and confidence cooking, then expecting perfection and restaurant quality results immediately is an easy way to quit on the process. And you know the only thing all good cooks have in common? Experience cooking. Almost all of the time, it's the only thing that separates a good cook from a bad cook. Time spent cooking. It goes a long way to have self-compassion and understanding that you're getting into the practice of cooking and the results don't matter as much as the experience. Did you resonate with one or more of the challenges I listed earlier? Did that make you feel bad about yourself or feel hopeless? It doesn't need to. Yes, as with most task-based things, ADHD will make cooking more challenging. But guess what group of people are ace at rising to a challenge? Those of us with ADHD. You can totally do this, and a few mistakes here or there doesn't make you a bad cook or a failure. Okay, broad stroke advice number 3, get to know yourself. This is related to the last broad stroke advice. Take the time to notice what your energy levels are, what kinds of foods you enjoy making and eating, and what would make you feel successful. Get acquainted with how ADHD factors into the cooking equation. A lot of ADHD folks I know who struggle with cooking try to follow very specific advice on how to make cooking easier, but all of our hangups are different and solutions for our specific sets of challenges will vary. When we know what exactly is getting in our way, our strategies can be more effective. Do you regularly overpurchase ingredients at the grocery store, then lose steam and don't feel like making it later on in the week? Then maybe it would make more sense to plan grocery shopping and cooking all on the same day. Do you get bored when you're heating up soup on medium, as the can of soup instructs you to, and you run off to do something else, leading to burned soup? Maybe it would make more sense to heat it up on high while you are constantly stirring it to up the urgency and shorten the cook time. That's what I do. Those instructions are for neurotypicals. We can adjust methods based on what works for us. Did you forget to add an important ingredient? What do you think happened to cause that misstep? Was it because of understimulation? Was it because the recipe takes too long to figure out and your eyes glazed over when looking at the ingredient list? Was it because you were rushing? Those are really different root causes, and using a solution for a different root cause would not be as effective. So think about what actually happened to lead to that misstep. I see a lot of low spoons tips that don't work for me. That doesn't mean I tell others not to do it. I'm just clear about why it doesn't work for me. For example, the tip to save soups and sauces in Ziploc freezer bags, then flatten them for the freezer. That never worked for me because it required me to defrost the bags in the fridge before I could fit it into a pan or bowl to heat up on the stove or in the microwave. For me, it makes more sense to put those soups and sauces in pint-sized deli containers that I got from the restaurant supply store. They're freezer, dishwasher, and microwave safe and reusable. I can take it out of the freezer, run some cold water around the outside, then push the frozen block into a bowl, then cover and microwave for immediate results. Again, if someone doesn't have a problem with taking the Ziploc bags out of the freezer the night before, that way probably works better for them because it's optimizing on freezer space. Ideal solutions vary from person to person, and we need to figure out what works best for us. Knowing ourselves isn't just important for methods. It's also great for the actual food you're making. If you made something and you aren't happy with the results, what about it don't you like? Instead of going straight into, it isn't good because I'm not good, analyzing what you don't like about it can give you the opportunity to make it the way you do want next time. Was it bland? That's easy. Up the seasoning. Was it soggy? Next time, add the food to a hotter pan or pull it off the heat sooner. There's likely an opportunity to improve the dish the next time you make it, as long as you're looking into why it wasn't a good result. Furthermore, knowing what flavors, textures, and types of food you will like will help with the cooking process. The most important person to impress with your cooking is yourself. Set yourself up for success. If there are things you don't enjoy eating, guess what? You don't have to make foods with those things, but you need to know what you don't want to have as an ingredient and why. For example, I used to really be against frozen vegetables, but really, I don't like frozen peas. The taste and texture of them give me the icks. And now I don't buy frozen peas, but I do buy frozen vegetables I do like green beans, cauliflower, and broccoli. This also applies to things we feel we should like. I am a proud Taiwanese American woman, and pork belly is something that is really prominent in Taiwanese food. It's also something that is somewhat of a foodie sweetheart. But just a few years ago, I finally admitted to myself that I don't like the texture of braised tendon or fat, which is something I always felt ashamed of, like I have to turn in my Asian card. But that was important for me to realize, and I don't have to make things that have gristle or fat on them when I'm cooking for myself. There are plenty of other things to make. It's important to make foods you like eating and be honest about those things. If you try to trick yourself into thinking you like kale and you don't, it wouldn't be shocking when you come home and don't want to eat that meal prep of kale salad. So be honest and get to know yourself. Broad stroke advice number 4, create fail-safes. With ADHD, time and energy are a premium and they can be hugely inconsistent. Some days after work, I won't have the motivating energy to cook anything. And some days I'll get off work and want to whip up something huge. It's not always predictable what our energy will be ahead of time. Allow for inconsistencies. This applies to a few things. I'll start with the holiday party and potluck scenario. It's fun to brainstorm fun ideas for what you can make, but if the day comes and you don't have the energy to follow through, have a few lower lift options you can have instead. Some options that have worked well for me is to get a box of those pre-portioned brownie bites, then drizzle orange-infused olive oil over it. Trust me, it's amazing, and it takes about 2 minutes to throw together. Also, getting 100 chicken McNuggets from a drive-thru is always a hit. And you can always ask the host of the party what they need. Usually, ice is something every party could use more of. I'll also show you my go-to recipe for lychee sangria. It takes less than a minute to throw together and is always a hit. Fail-safes are great for everyday eating too. Have some go-to recipes that only use pantry and frozen items. Then, if you can't get yourself to go to the store that day, you'll still have things you can make. If you can't get yourself to cook, figure out what you can eat that you still feel good about. I have a short list of things to eat when I can't get myself to make anything in the kitchen. That can be portion soups I have in the freezer. It can be one of those frozen meals from Trader Joe's. It can be a cup of noodle. It can be a Crunch Wrap and Diet Baja Blast from the Taco Bell drive-thru. Either way, I'm fed and I have no shame in taking any of those routes. Furthermore, if I'm going to the Taco Bell drive-thru, it's a signal for me that I'm nearing burnout and I give myself the rest of the night to recover and practice self-care. And for those leftovers you don't feel like eating, or the produce that's languishing in the vegetable hospice, or that meat that's approaching its expiration date, figure out when it's do or die time. When does it need to be put into the freezer so you can have that soup another day? Having a plan of action for when we just can't lowers the consequences and shame about our varying energy levels. If you follow these 4 broad strokes advice, cooking can be more approachable and more successful. And if you're having a hard time getting down to the bottom of what's getting in your way, I highly recommend seeking an ADHD coach or counselor to help you process all of that. Now I'll show you some of my favorite Low Spoons recipes. I'll show you a few of my favorite cheat ingredients that I use to make food taste better, some easy high protein snacks I have when I'm feeling a little shaky in the middle of the day, what I make for easy breakfasts, some Low Spoons dinners to throw together, and a few crowd-pleasing potluck options that don't require a lot of executive function. Let's get started. First, I want to introduce you to a few of my favorite cheat ingredients. Bacon crumbles can add protein and extra flavors to pasta, stir fries, and other dishes. I keep a big jar of stock base in my fridge, and that makes it so I can add a little oomph to everything I'm making, from pasta sauces to soups. I also keep a stir fry sauce on hand in case I don't feel like making my own sauce. They make stir fries a no-brainer. It's nice to have a seasoning that you like to use in simple dishes like roasted vegetables or pan-cooked meats. I like to use a mushroom seasoning because it adds a really nice umami flavor to everything I put it on, and I don't really need to add much else to it. To make any dish more appealing, I keep a few garnishes on deck. I like furikake and togarashi. They're pretty inexpensive and make everything look a little fancier. Here's a quick fix I have for midday jitters. I take frozen cooked shrimp, put them in a bowl and cover with water, then set a timer for 15 minutes. After that, I drain the water and eat it with cocktail sauce for a really easy shrimp cocktail. Here's my process for overnight oats, something I make for no work breakfast first thing in the morning. I make them 2 at a time, so I only have to do it every other day. You can add whatever you want to it, but my standard is a half cup of rolled or quick oats, a tablespoon of chia seeds, a tablespoon of flax meal, and 2 tablespoons of peanut powder. You can alternatively add peanut butter instead, but I'm weird about the waxy feeling the peanut oils have in my mouth when I'm eating this, so I opt for peanut powder instead. I like to add a cup of lactose-free milk to this, but you can use any milk you'd like. If you like your oats thinner, add more milk. Then give it a quick stir, cover, and put them in the fridge. Then in the morning, give it another quick stir and eat it. Next are a few low-lift potluck options. The first is goat cheese stuffed bacon wrapped dates. For this, turn your oven on to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Cut your bacon package in half so you have a bunch of half strips. Take your pitted dates, cut a slit in one side, then take a spoon and scrape some goat cheese into the crevice. Then take your half slice of bacon and wrap it around the outside of the date, then spear it with a toothpick so it stays in place. Do this as many times as you have dates and or bacon, then put it on a baking sheet covered in parchment paper or foil, then put it into the oven for a half an hour. Set a timer. You might have to wait a little longer after the timer goes off if the bacon isn't crispy enough, but when they're ready, this is what you get. After you pull them out of the oven, place them on a plate lined with paper towels so they absorb the residual bacon grease, and that's it. You're all done. Next is something that can also be a breakfast or a midday snack. It's Brazilian-style cheese breads. For this, you'll need a blender or food processor. I use a stick blender, but you can use a regular one too. Okay, first, turn your oven on to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. In your blender, or in my case, cup to blend in, add a cup of milk, a third cup of olive oil, 2 eggs, a teaspoon of salt, 1 cup of shredded Parmesan cheese, and a half cup of sharp cheddar cheese. Then 2 cups of tapioca flour. Here's where I tell you that one way my ADHD presents is that I always try to make things in a receptacle just barely too small for what my needs are. Anyway, I like to stir it around before blending so the tapioca flour doesn't stick to the crevices of the blender all weird. After you get all the ingredients into the container, blend the whole thing up. Look at me spill. I promise you it's not that big of a deal when this happens. It just takes a wipe. Okay, when the whole thing is blended up, spray your mini muffin pans, then fill them up with batter. Then bake for 15 to 20 minutes until they're puffy and golden brown. They will look like this when you pull them out of the oven and may deflate slightly after they cool down. And that's it. These cheese breads will be chewy and cheesy. Here's the texture of it when pulled apart. The last potluck offering is a beverage because those are fun and people don't tend to bring many of them. This is a lychee sangria. For this, I mix equal parts Sauvignon Blanc and sweetened aloe juice. Then take a can of lychees and throw a few of them in the pitcher. Then bring a few in a container on the side so everyone gets a nice lychee garnish. If you wanted to make an alcohol-free option with lychees, you can brew a pitcher of iced tea, then add the lychee syrup from the can to the iced tea for an easy lychee sweet tea. Here are a few low spoon dinner options. These don't require a cutting board or any prep. The first is a green bean and ground pork stir fry. You can use ground chicken, ground beef, crumbled tofu, anything you want in place of the pork. For this, make your rice. I actually have a tiny rice cooker that only makes 1 cup of rice at a time, which is perfect for my one-person household. Then heat up a pan on medium-high and put a little bit of toasted sesame oil in the pan. When it gets hot enough so that the oil ripples a little bit on the surface, add half of a bag of frozen green beans and toss it in the pan to coat in the hot oil. Keep tossing the green beans on the hot pan until they're no longer frozen and seem to be nice and hot. Then take out the green beans and put them into your serving bowl. Then put your ground pork into the hot pan. Use your spatula to flatten and separate the ground pork into crumbles. When the crumbles are almost completely cooked, take your stir-fry sauce and add about 3 tablespoons of sauce to the pork, then stir it until it's evenly mixed. There will likely be liquid from cooking the pork left over, which will mix with the stir-fry sauce. Keep cooking the pork with the sauce. The sauce will incorporate while also infusing into the ground pork. When the sauce has almost entirely evaporated or incorporated into the pork, add your green beans back to the pan and stir the whole thing around so the green beans and pork are evenly mixed. And that's it. Serve it with your rice. The last demo is a recycled video from what I made for an Instagram reel, which I did not reshoot because I've already made way too much food in this presentation for one person. It's my Italian sausage, spinach, and white bean soup. Heat some oil in a pot, just enough to coat the bottom of the pan. It doesn't really matter what kind. I used olive oil. While the oil is heating, I open all my bags and cans and heat up the water for the soup in my kettle to save some time. Once the oil is hot, throw in the Italian sausage and agitate it with the spatula until you get a pot full of cooked crumbles. Once the sausage is cooked, dump in the can of diced tomatoes and white beans, including the liquid, then the bag of frozen chopped spinach. Then add the hot water from the kettle, just enough so that the amount in the pot starts to rise a little bit, and a big scoop of chicken base, which you can get off of the spoon by just stirring it in the hot liquid for a little bit. About a teaspoon of thyme or Italian seasoning, a few bay leaves, and black pepper. Give it a stir, then turn down the heat and let it simmer while you put everything away. And that's it. This soup is hearty and nutritious, so I hope you like it. If you want to try any of the recipes in this demo, download the recipe card handout for this talk. And if you have a question about the talk, including any of the broad stroke advice, type it into the Events Air platform now.